winter of 1892, whispers spread through the affluent heart of Mexico City. Neighbors along Tuba Street spoke in hushed tones of the blood-curdling screams that echoed from behind the iron balconies and limestone walls of an imposing mansion. These were not the sounds of revolution or common violence. They were something far more sinister. Something that made even seasoned police officers admit the cries still haunted their dreams. What lay inside that house would shake the nation to its core, a chamber of horrors, orchestrated by a woman who had deceived high society with her impeccable facade. Her name was Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano, and history would remember her as Laibe, the terrifying one, Mexico's first documented female serial killer. Her crimes were so grotesque that famed illustrator José Guadalupe Posada etched her legacy into artwork that continues to unsettle viewers to this day. Before we dive into this forgotten nightmare, if you're drawn to true crime tales that expose the darkest corners of human nature, subscribe to our channel and tap the notification bell. Like this video if you're brave enough to learn the full truth, and comment below with your city and state. We want to know who's listening. This story was buried in silence, erased by shame and disbelief. But it must be told not for shock value, but because it reveals how evil thrives behind masks of respectability and how society's blind spots become breeding grounds for predators. In 1887, Mexico City was a city of contradictions, caught in the ambitions of President Porfirio Díaz's modernization campaign. Gas lights flickered over cobblestone streets, where horse-drawn carriages carried wealthy women in European silks past starving children begging on corners. In this world of brutal inequality, Guadalupe stood as a pillar of virtue. At 43, she was a widowed matron of high standing, managing her late husband's affairs with business savvy and maintaining strong ties with the elite. Her mansion was an architectural statement of dignity, and she herself, austere, tall, always in black, moved through the world with an air of untouchable grace. She never missed Mass, donated generously to the church, and ran a successful servant placement agency catering to Mexico's upper crust. But behind closed doors, Guadalupe had created a hidden domain of suffering. In the servants' quarters, she conducted what she called her special training methods, rituals of pain disguised as discipline. Her adult son, Aurelio, a pale, jittery figure addicted to laudanum, lived upstairs in terrified silence. He had learned to stay out of sight, knowing the chilling look in his mother's eyes that signaled a new session was about to begin. Guadalupe's cruel enterprise was perfectly designed. Poor families from rural regions sent their daughters to the city in search of work. Alone, illiterate, and undocumented, these girls vanished without anyone powerful enough to notice. For years, she restricted herself to punishments that left no lasting marks, believing herself justified until the day she crossed the final threshold. On January 18, 1887, Mexico City awoke beneath a cold, silvery fog that blurred the streets like a dream half-remembered. That morning, 16-year-old Casimira Juarez arrived at the mansion. She had traveled 6 days from the misty hills of Michoacán, carrying her life in a cloth bundle. Orphaned by cholera, she had nothing left but a letter of recommendation from her priest and the address of Señora Bejarano, known for placing girls in respectable homes. Guadalupe opened the door with a practiced smile, instantly measuring the girl's vulnerability. Casimira was ideal, young, desperate, and grateful. Her dark braids were neat, her patched dress clean, her eyes filled with cautious hope. Guadalupe's voice carried the weight of command as she read the letter. Good references are essential. I maintain high standards. She led Casimira through marble corridors lined with religious art and heavy heirloom furniture, ending in a small servant's room. Narrow bed, wash basin, crucifix. You'll find I treat my servants fairly. Guadalupe said, her tone cool and composed. But I demand absolute obedience and discretion. My clients expect nothing less. For 2 weeks, Casimira settled into a routine that seemed almost kind compared to the life she left behind. She rose before dawn to prepare meals, cleaned through the mornings, and helped with laundry in the afternoons. Guadalupe watched her constantly, a gaze the girl mistook for professional diligence. But the truth was far more terrifying, and her real ordeal was only just beginning. What Casimira never realized was that she was being observed like a specimen under a microscope. Guadalupe studied her with the precision of a scientist, analyzing every flicker of emotion, every reaction to pain, fear, or correction. She tracked the girl's responses meticulously, noting what criticisms unsettled her, how long she could stand without food, and how quickly tears came when pushed too far. Guadalupe wasn't punishing her. She was preparing something that required absolute control over the human mind and body. The shift in treatment came subtly. Guadalupe began finding faults where none existed. Dust invisible to the naked eye, wrinkles on smooth linens, food prepared exactly to recipe, but declared unpalatable. Casimira responded by apologizing and trying harder, which only seemed to deepen her employer's dissatisfaction. One evening, Guadalupe's voice cut through the cold air with chilling finality. "I'm starting to think your priest oversold you. Perhaps you need more rigorous instruction." From that moment, Casimira's life spiraled into torment. It started with petty punishments, forced stillness for hours, skipped meals blamed on imagined clumsiness, bleeding palms from endless scrubbing, followed by rebuke for staining the stone. Aurelio, ever present in the background, like a phantom, recognized the signs. He had seen his mother follow this pattern before, but never with such ferocity. When he tried to intervene, her response was icy and immediate. "Have you forgotten who keeps this house running? Or would you prefer to take Casimira's place?" The message was unmistakable. Aurelio fled to the upper floors, dosing himself heavily with laudanum, retreating deeper into numbness as dread filled every corner of the house. By February, Casimira's days had turned into a living nightmare. What began as disciplinary correction had escalated into methodical, almost ritualistic torture. The mansion's basement, once a storage room, had been transformed into a hidden chamber of horrors. Down there, stripped and freezing, Casimira became the centerpiece of Guadalupe's twisted obsession. The girl's emaciated frame, starved into weakness, was dissected by her captor's cruel gaze. "Look what you've become," Guadalupe would whisper, her voice soft with terrifying intimacy. "This is what happens when servants forget their place. But don't worry, I'm going to fix you." The brazier that once warmed rooms was now used to heat iron rods. Guadalupe would bring them close just enough to send Casimira into spasms of terror before the pain even began. The burns were quick but excruciating, carefully placed to prolong agony without causing death. Between sessions, she treated the girl's wounds herself, ensuring survival just long enough to begin again. Her torture wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Guadalupe forced Casimira to confess to sins she hadn't committed to, thank her for punishments, to apologize for her own suffering. With time, the girl's sense of reality dissolved. She began to believe she deserved everything. Above Aurelio was unraveling. Trapped in his room, he filled journals with fragmented thoughts, each entry more unstable than the last. February 15th. The screams were worse last night. I tried to cover my ears, but they get through. Mother says it's for the girl's improvement, but the way she says it, God help me. I think she enjoys it. February 22nd. Blood on the cellar stairs. She said it was a cooking accident. But how much blood does cooking need? February 28th. Haven't seen Casimira in days. Mother says she's ill, but the sounds below don't sound like sickness. I can't write what they sound like. In early March, after 6 weeks of unrelenting torment, Casimira's body gave out. During what was meant to be another routine session, her heart simply stopped. Guadalupe felt a sharp pang, not of remorse, but a strange mix of satisfaction and irritation. The experience had been intoxicating, more powerful than anything she'd known. But now it was over, and a problem remained disposal. She handled it with the same cold efficiency as everything else. Wrapped in old sheets, Casimira's body was loaded onto a cart in the darkest hours of night. Guadalupe had already chosen a burial spot, one of the vacant, overgrown lots at the city's edge where no one looked too closely. As she dug the shallow grave, she made a quiet, chilling decision. This would not be the last time. The death of Casimira Juarez marked the beginning of what Guadalupe considered her professional era. She had learned from the missteps of her first kill how quickly things could unravel if she let her obsession outrun her caution. The solution was strategy, patience, control. For nearly a year, she threw herself into her public life with renewed vigor. She organized charity events for the cathedral, expanded her servant placement agency, and deepened her ties with Mexico City's elite. To the world, she was the epitome of pious widowhood, elegant, industrious, generous. But every social call, every business deal, every mass she attended served a single-purpose camouflage. By day, Guadalupe played the role of saint. But at night she planned, sharpened, refined. The hunger was still there, and next time she would feed it better. Guadalupe devoted herself to refining every aspect of her hidden operation. She studied social patterns to identify ideal victims, researched advanced techniques of restraint and torture to replace her earlier, cruder methods, and developed systems to ensure that disappearances would raise no alarms. She also turned her attention to managing Aurelio, whose fragile mind had begun to fray. He was becoming unpredictable, prone to fits of weeping and wild confessions about sins no one had committed. To contain the risk, Guadalupe arranged for him to receive treatment from a respected German physician, specializing in nervous disorders, ensuring that if he ever spoke out, his words would be dismissed as the incoherent ravings of a troubled invalid. Her next opportunity arrived in September 1888, when Maria Santos, a desperate mother, brought her 15-year-old daughter Elena to the mansion in search of work. The family had lost their farm to drought and debt, and now struggled to survive in a city overflowing with the displaced and destitute. Maria would have accepted any offer, no matter the conditions, and Guadalupe, with practiced grace, welcomed them. Elena was everything she desired, young, healthy, alone, and with a resilient spirit that made the prospect of breaking her especially appealing. Weakness bored Guadalupe. Strength, on the other hand, offered a challenge worthy of her attention. The early days of Elena's employment followed a familiar script, but this time Guadalupe applied the lessons she had learned. Her manipulations were more subtle, her cruelty delivered with a smile, each escalation designed to feel like a natural consequence. Rather than striking suddenly, she wove a web of confusion and self-doubt. "You seem to be making more mistakes lately," she would say in a tone of gentle concern. "Perhaps the city is too much for someone from the countryside. Some girls just aren't meant for civilized life." Elena, earnest and eager to please, would insist she was doing her best, but that only led to lectures about the difference between effort and excellence. The atmosphere became suffocating. No task was done quite right. No behavior was quite proper. Gradually, the girl began to internalize the belief that something within her was fundamentally wrong. Punishments began subtly. A missed spot of dust meant standing in place for hours. A dish that cooled too quickly earned withheld meals. A fleeting expression Guadalupe deemed insolent resulted in a night locked in the coal cellar. But she moved slowly, carefully, letting days or even weeks pass between episodes to ensure Elena adapted to each new level of degradation without realizing the slope she was sliding down. By the time the torment became undeniable, the girl's will had already eroded. Aurelio watched the descent with growing dread. He tried at first to intervene. "She seems frightened," he said cautiously. Guadalupe's response was measured. "That shows you have compassion," she said. "But compassion without wisdom leads to ruin. These country girls are lazy by nature, deceitful even. Would you prefer she end up on the streets, selling herself for survival? I'm giving her a future." When Aurelio pushed further, her tone darkened. "If you feel you understand domestic management better than I do, you're welcome to take over her training. It would be instructive." The threat was thinly veiled. Aurelio had seen enough to know what training meant. He backed down, dosing himself with more laudanum and burying his fear in pages of disjointed journal entries. By December, Elena was a shell of the girl who had once walked through the mansion's gates. Her eyes were hollow, her posture hunched, her movements those of someone who had learned to anticipate violence. Guadalupe had perfected her system. The basement had been remodeled into a place built for suffering. Chains now hung from the beams, their links polished by struggling limbs. A brazier glowed beside implements blackened with age and use. Most chilling of all was the chair crafted by a blacksmith under the pretense of aiding invalids. It held the body in place while exposing it completely to pain. Elena's final days unfolded like a grim performance. Guadalupe planned every moment as if scripting a play, with each scene escalating the girl's torment and confusion. The sessions alternated between agony and brief disorienting kindness. She would apply salves to the very wounds she had inflicted, whispering, "This is for your soul. Every suffering brings you closer to salvation." This justification was new proof that Guadalupe had built a theology around her violence. She believed herself a purifier, a savior of corrupted souls, enacting divine justice where the church failed. Elena's death came abruptly during one of the climactic scenes Guadalupe had orchestrated. Her heart gave out before the grand finale could be completed. For a moment, Guadalupe stood in the silence, overcome not by grief, but by a sense of incompletion, as though a masterpiece had been cut short. It wasn't a death that disturbed her. It was the timing. But she had learned from Casimira, and now she learned from Elena. Her next victim would bring greater fulfillment. The process would be even more refined. As before, she wrapped the body, waited for the darkest hour, and made her way to the edge of the city. But this time she was more cautious. She had scouted several locations to avoid drawing attention. No two graves would ever lie close enough to form a pattern. Her nocturnal rituals followed no predictable rhythm. She varied the days, the routes, the times, eliminating the possibility of witnesses. 3 weeks later, when Maria Santos returned frantic and trembling, demanding to know why her daughter hadn't written, Guadalupe met her at the door with a calm and well-practiced story. Elena, she explained, had proven unsuited to the work and left of her own accord. Some girls, she said with an air of regret, simply aren't cut out for city life. I gave her a chance, but she couldn't adapt. Her expression was one of sympathetic helplessness. I'm sorry, Señora Santos, but I haven't seen her in weeks. I'm afraid Elena became quite ill after Christmas. Guadalupe explained softly, her expression full of carefully rehearsed sympathy. She developed a fever that seemed to affect her mind as much as her body. She became convinced that something terrible had happened to her family and insisted on leaving at once to warn you. I tried to persuade her to stay to wait until she was stronger. But you know how stubborn young people can be when they fear for their loved ones. The lie was flawless, specific enough to soothe a desperate mother's fears, vague enough to defy verification. Maria Santos left the mansion convinced her daughter was somewhere on the road, braving the perils of Mexico's countryside out of misguided love. She never imagined that Elena's bones were already lying in a shallow grave, scattered and half-buried on the outskirts of the city. The years between Elena Santos's death in late 1888 and Guadalupe's next killings in 1892 marked the peak of her criminal mastery. She had learned to discipline her impulses, transforming chaotic compulsion into deliberate ritual. Every urge was redirected into planning, selection, and concealment. Publicly, she flourished. She became one of Mexico City's most celebrated philanthropists, organizing earthquake relief funding, orphanages, and donating so generously to church projects that even the Archbishop lauded her piety from the pulpit. Her reputation became an unassailable fortress. To accuse her of cruelty would have seemed not just implausible, but blasphemous. Her domestic placement business expanded into a powerful operation, granting her access to a constant flow of vulnerable girls from across central Mexico. Elite families prized her reliability and discretion. Poor parents desperate for a lifeline saw her as a savior. What none of them knew was that Guadalupe had built a psychological filtration system for her victims. She sought girls who were alone, emotionally fragile, and physically appealing to her increasingly specific tastes. Above all, she hunted for the strong, those whose inner resolve would make their destruction a slow, delicious unraveling. Meanwhile, Aurelio's decline offered an unexpected benefit. His mind had disintegrated under years of exposure to his mother's hidden atrocities. Now, almost permanently confined to his rooms, he floated through life in a drugged haze of laudanum and opium. When he did appear, his wild eyes and slurred speech marked him instantly as unstable, his claims the ramblings of a broken man. Guadalupe encouraged this perception, hiring prominent doctors to treat him, and ensuring that his supposed illness was blamed on a tragic inheritance, not the psychological war waged silently beneath their roof. But under this flawless mask, Guadalupe was preparing her most ambitious experiment. Casimira and Elena had served their purpose, taught her restraint, control, and the value of timing. Now she wanted more. She wanted to break not one but several victims at once. In her journals, she called it layered instruction. In her mind, it was evolution. In the spring of 1892, the opportunity arrived. Esperanza Vega, only 19, but burdened with the care of her two younger sisters. Carmen and Rosa came knocking at the mansion's door. Their family had been shattered by drought and political unrest in Hidalgo. With no father, no home, and no prospects, Esperanza had come to the capital, hoping for salvation. Guadalupe greeted them with maternal warmth. She studied them the way a collector examines rare objects. Esperanza was tall, dignified, with a strength Guadalupe couldn't wait to erode. Carmen, timid and anxious, was already prey to fear. Rosa, just 15, possessed a sharp mind and quiet defiance that might one day lead rebellion, if not neutralized. "I can use all three of you." Guadalupe smiled, her voice honeyed. "It's rare to find sisters who can work together. You'll support one another through the transition. Families tend to uphold the highest standards." What she didn't say was that she had planned for this. She had long imagined a scenario where she could manipulate blood ties into weapons, where love could be turned inward, where loyalty became leverage. What followed was a campaign of deception so precise it bordered on artistry. For the first month, the Vega sisters were treated with kindness. They were given decent food, light chores, and even permitted the occasional afternoon to explore the city. This illusion of safety was essential. Guadalupe needed them to feel hopeful. She needed them to invest in their new lives, to form attachments to believe they had finally escaped the ruin of their past. Only then could she begin the systematic destruction of everything they valued. She started with words. Subtle comparisons, quiet praise of one sister, quiet critique of another. She sowed seeds of resentment. "Rosa is adapting quite well," she remarked to Esperanza one day. "Not everyone from the countryside is capable of refinement, you know. Perhaps Carmen would benefit from closer supervision. She seems overwhelmed." These comments, gently delivered, created quiet storms. Esperanza felt the sting of failure. Carmen, desperate for approval, became anxious and eager. Rosa began to withdraw, sensing a trap, but unable to name it. By June, the sisters no longer fully trusted each other. They still shared the same quarters, still ate the same meals, but inside they had been separated. That was when Guadalupe brought them to the basement. The chamber once Elena Santos's tomb had been rebuilt into a theater of cruelty. New equipment lined the walls. Restraints had been modified for greater flexibility. Surgical tools gleamed in trays, and in the center stood 3 black iron chairs specially designed to hold each girl in a fixed position, all facing one another. That arrangement was the core of her design. She had discovered that forcing victims to witness each other's suffering heightened their terror and broke their spirits faster than isolation ever could. Their first trip to the basement was framed as a training session. Guadalupe maintained her calm, instructive tone. "Some aspects of service require deeper instruction," she said, walking slowly behind the girls. "This room has been prepared for that purpose." They were restrained gently, not hurt yet. She let them experience the panic of immobilization, the horror of helplessness. "The most important quality in a servant is obedience," she said softly. "Obedience requires understanding, and understanding sometimes comes through experiences that may be unpleasant, but necessary." She watched as the sisters' faces shifted from confusion to fear. They were still too shocked to scream. That would come later. For now, Guadalupe smiled and savored the beginning of what she knew would be her most satisfying work yet. To demonstrate the basement's true purpose, Guadalupe subjected each of the Vega sisters to a carefully staged lesson. The pain she inflicted was measured and precise, just enough to traumatize without leaving permanent marks. Heated metal pressed briefly to Carmen's skin. Simulated drownings that sent her into uncontrollable panic. A primitive battery gifted by a corrupt physician administered electric shocks that caused spasms of pain and fear without lasting harm. All the while, Guadalupe maintained a running commentary, as if conducting a class. Torture in her hands became instruction. Suffering was rebranded as privilege. "You see, Carmen, how your resistance only delays our progress," she murmured calmly, applying the glowing iron to the girl's shoulder. Then turning to Rosa with cold precision, she added, "And you, dear, can thank your sister for making this harder than it needed to be. Perhaps you'd like to encourage her cooperation." These twisted exercises in shared trauma shattered the last bonds of sisterhood. Within weeks, the 3 young women, once inseparable, had been reduced to isolated, desperate individuals, each vying for even the smallest reprieve, even if it meant sacrificing the others. Esperanza, the eldest, bore the cruelest weight. Guadalupe reminded her constantly that Carmen and Rosa were suffering because of her. "It could all stop if you ask me to take their punishments on your behalf." She'd whisper, a serpent's voice sliding into Esperanza's ear during long, sleepless nights. When the girl inevitably accepted begging to take the pain meant for her sisters, Guadalupe allowed it briefly. Then she reversed the roles, accusing the younger girls of allowing their sister to suffer alone. The maze had no exit, Each act of love became a tool for deeper torment. No gesture of selflessness was safe. By the end of 1892, even Guadalupe's meticulous double life began to crack under the pressure. The physical demands of maintaining 3 simultaneous victims, combined with her own spiraling mental state, wore her down. She grew thinner, her eyes wild with manic energy, her once impeccable grooming now inconsistent. Most alarmingly, she began speaking to people who weren't there, holding whispered conversations over dinner with phantom colleagues about improvements and methods. And then she made a mistake. She invited Aurelio to witness her work. I think it's time, she told him one evening in December, her voice brittle with intensity. You're old enough now. Your education is incomplete without understanding the truth of human nature. Aurelio recoiled, feigning illness, swallowing laudanum by the mouthful, stalling for time. But her patience was eroding. He feared correctly that refusal might soon mean taking a seat in one of those basement chairs. It was this fear that finally pushed him to act. In brief moments of lucidity, Aurelio began documenting everything with desperate clarity. Dates, names, methods, locations. His ramblings turned into coherent testimony. December 15th heard 3 distinct screams last night. She claims only 2 new girls, but I know better. She stayed in the basement until dawn. December 20th, found bloody clothing. She claims it's from a medical training session. How much blood does training require? December 28th. She told me I'd have to participate soon. I don't think I can refuse again. Then on New Year's Day, 1893, a crack formed in Guadalupe's world. Father Miguel Herrera arrived for a routine visit, an annual exchange of pleasantries, donations, and spiritual appearances. But on that day, Guadalupe was mid-session. The priest was kept waiting while she scrambled to compose herself, but the muffled screams that rose from the basement were impossible to explain away. Senora Bejarano, the priest asked carefully, "Is someone unwell?" Those cries, they don't sound like fever dreams. Guadalupe's excuse, a servant delirious from influenza, seemed plausible. But Father Herrera wasn't convinced. What he heard lingered with him. He began asking questions, quiet ones at first. Neighbors spoke of strange sounds, hours long, screaming the scent of burning flesh wafting through open windows, and the odd absence of any young women supposedly working inside the house. Tradesmen added more disturbing details. A blacksmith recalled making custom restraints far beyond the needs of domestic discipline. A physician admitted supplying medical tools and drugs under vague pretense. Even local grocers noticed something odd. Guadalupe claimed to run a full household, yet her food purchases had dwindled sharply. By early 1893, her activities had reached a peak of depravity. The Vega sisters had endured over 6 months of systematic torture. Esperanza, once the fierce protector, now slipped between catatonia and violent hysteria. Her body was a map of agony, precise burns, reopened wounds, internal damage that defied decency. Carmen had retreated into madness, speaking to people who weren't there, smiling through horrors that should have destroyed her. This dissociation fascinated Guadalupe. She saw it not as collapse, but as a new puzzle, how to pierce through insanity itself. Rosa remained the most lucid, and that clarity was her curse. She saw it all, understood it all. She begged, pleaded, negotiated. Guadalupe rewarded her with false hope, then crushed it again and again, savoring the breaking of spirit more than body. But even this chamber of horrors had limits. The sisters were dying. Their slow disintegration meant Guadalupe would soon need new subjects, and so she made a fatal decision. In her eagerness to continue, she sought out a replacement before her current victims were gone. Julia Mendez, a widow from Querétaro, arrived with her 14-year-old daughter Isabella, hoping to escape destitution. Guadalupe saw the girl as ideal, young, isolated, pliable. But in her haste to make room, she accelerated the Vega sisters' deaths. It was a mistake. She also failed to realize how far Aurelio's rebellion had come. While she plotted her next project, Aurelio finalized his. His journal had become a dossier. He had begun secretly meeting with Father Herrera, passing notes, sketches, and observations. He mapped burial sites, described victims, explained routines. His testimony was chilling, not because it painted his mother as momentarily mad, but because it revealed the truth. Guadalupe Bejarano was a methodical, calculating sadist who had perfected her crimes over years of practice. On the night of February 14th, 1893, Guadalupe prepared what she called her final act with the Vega sisters, a prolonged spectacle of death before welcoming Isabella into her nightmare. But Aurelio had made his choice. Driven by the terror that he might be next, and fueled by a fragile resolve, he ensured she would never reach that next chapter. He handed over everything, and with that, Mexico's most monstrous secret began to unravel. Father Miguel Herrera, sickened by the revelations shared by Aurelio, yet paralyzed by the danger of confronting a woman as influential as Guadalupe Bejarano, spent weeks navigating the political and ecclesiastical minefield her arrest would require. The evidence was damning, yes, but without direct proof, the consequences of a failed prosecution would be catastrophic. Guadalupe's ironclad social standing meant that even suspicion, if not handled with precision, could destroy Aurelio, the church, and any civil officials who dared to act. The risk was too great unless the proof was irrefutable. The solution emerged when Aurelio, trembling with resolve, agreed to provide access during one of his mother's sessions. On the night of February 14th, 1893, as Guadalupe descended into her basement to carry out what she had planned as the final torment of the Vega sisters, Aurelio unlatched the rear entrance and silently led a hand-picked group of investigators to the threshold of her private hell. What they found inside defied every expectation. The chamber they entered was a cathedral of suffering, a place so alien to human experience that even the most hardened officers recoiled in horror. Several vomited on the spot. Others, overcome with rage, had to be physically restrained from attacking the woman standing at the center of it all. The Vega sisters were strapped into restraint chairs, their bodies bearing such extensive and precise damage that weeks of medical evaluation would be needed to catalog the full scope of their injuries. Esperanza was unconscious, barely clinging to life. Carmen sat in catatonic silence, her eyes fixed on nothing, as tears streamed down her hollow face. Rosa, ravaged and trembling, still managed to speak, though her broken words were not cries for rescue, but whispered pleas for death. And yet, it was Guadalupe who stole the air from the room. Clad in ceremonial black, her posture regal, she calmly continued her work as if unaware or uninterested in the men who had just entered. She turned slowly, surgical instruments in hand, and said with eerie composure, "Gentlemen, I assume you have proper authorization for this intrusion into my private household affairs." There was no panic, no fear, no shame. Her detachment was total. When questioned, she spoke of moral instruction and intensive guidance, insisting her victims were students in need of correction. In her mind, she was not a monster. She was a teacher misunderstood and interrupted. The physical evidence left no room for ambiguity. The basement was a laboratory of pain. Investigators found journals filled with diagrams and notes, each entry a meticulous record of experimentation. There were modified medical tools, surgically precise restraint devices, and personal effects stolen from victims, each one a souvenir of suffering. The most damning material, however, came from her own hand. Her journal revealed not just method, but intent, calculated, sustained, and unrepentant. October 15th, 1892. The eldest sister's resistance continues to provide excellent opportunities for demonstrating consequences to the younger ones. Pain shared among blood multiplies in effect. Technique promising. November 3rd, 1892. Middle sister's dissociation can be briefly reversed through targeted threats to siblings. Protective instincts override psychotic withdrawal under correct stimuli. Further testing required. December 12th, 1892. Subjects entering terminal decline. Psychological returns diminishing. Final phases now in planning. New acquisitions needed. The arrest of Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano the next morning exploded across Mexico like a cannon blast. The headlines eclipsed every political crisis, every tragedy of the decade. A serial killer, an elite widow, a church patroness, a beloved socialite, unmasked as the architect of atrocities so severe they stunned the nation. People struggled to reconcile the facts. How could a woman praised from the pulpit, decorated for charity, admired by government officials, and the upper class have committed crimes so foul they defied imagination? But denial couldn't survive the evidence. The emaciated, mutilated bodies of the Vega sisters, living proof of her depravity, left no doubt. The torture devices, surgical instruments, and personal trophies erased all arguments of misunderstanding. And Guadalupe's own words, documented with clinical pride, made clear that this was no madness born of grief, but a fully conscious pursuit of suffering. Preliminary hearings began within days. The courtroom was a furnace of scrutiny, crowded with journalists, church leaders, reformers, and stunned citizens who came not just to witness justice, but to understand how a woman like Guadalupe could hide evil so expertly for so long. She sat through it all with placid indifference. Her statements to the court were not defenses, but lectures. These girls arrived as ignorant country peasants, she explained. Through structured instruction, I gave them the tools for spiritual elevation. Yes, it involved hardship, but purification requires fire. There was no remorse, no apology. Her voice carried the firm authority of someone convinced of her righteousness. To Guadalupe, her victims were not people, but case studies, vessels of moral impurity she had been called to purge. Their screams, their suffering, their shattered bodies were simply the cost of transformation. The prosecution, led by one of Mexico's most formidable attorneys, delivered a case so airtight it left little room for ambiguity. Beyond the crimes against the Vega sisters, investigators linked Guadalupe directly to the disappearances of Casimira Juarez and Elena Santos. Her journals led search teams to burial sites on the city's edge, where bones were unearthed and identified. Medical experts testified to the sophistication of her methods, emphasizing not only her anatomical knowledge, but her ability to prolong agony while avoiding fatality. These were not chaotic acts of madness. They were engineered experiences carefully constructed for maximal pain and psychological ruin. Perhaps the most shocking testimony came not from doctors or lawmen, but from church officials. Quietly, they admitted that rumors had swirled about the Bejarano household for years. Whispers had been ignored. Complaints had been deflected. Guadalupe's wealth and reputation had served as a shield, and few dared pierce it. Her status, more than secrecy, had kept her safe. And then came José Guadalupe Posada, Mexico's most renowned popular artist, known for his dark and insightful engravings, saw in this case something deeper than horror, a mirror of society itself. Working from courtroom sketches and witness descriptions, he created illustrations that burned their way into public consciousness. His artwork didn't just depict the devices or the victims. It showed the layered lies that made such crimes possible. The blind respect for social standing, the silence of institutions, the way a polished surface could conceal a monstrous core. In one of his most haunting prints, Posada depicted Guadalupe as a skeletal matron, seated in her torture chamber with a rosary in one hand and a branding iron in the other, smiling serenely beneath a black lace veil while children's shadows screamed from the walls behind her. It was not just an image of one woman's evil. It was an indictment of every person, every structure that had let her thrive. The most haunting of Posada's illustrations depicted Guadalupe in her underground chamber, surrounded by cruel devices, her victims writhing in the shadows behind her. But it wasn't the instruments or the pain that made the image unforgettable. It was her expression. Composed, serene, elegantly dressed in black silk as if hosting an afternoon salon. The contrast between civility and depravity was the very essence of the horror. These images were widely circulated across Mexico and beyond, embedding Guadalupe Bejarano into the national psyche, not as a criminal, but as a symbol of how evil can wear the most respectable face. Her trial concluded in September 1893, but justice, at least as the public envisioned it, remained elusive. Despite overwhelming evidence and the public's demand for the death penalty, Guadalupe received a sentence of just 10 years and 8 months. The verdict shocked the nation. Yet it reflected the limits of the era's legal system, ill-equipped to handle crimes of this scale, and bound by lingering societal beliefs that even monsters, if they were women, deserved leniency. Aurelio, though instrumental in exposing the crimes, was sentenced to 2 years for complicity. The court acknowledged his psychological trauma, but argued that his silence had cost lives. Of the Vega sisters only, Carmen and Rosa survived. Esperanza, already broken beyond repair, succumbed to her injuries within weeks of rescue. Carmen remained lost to the world, trapped in a fog of delusions. Rosa, once the most aware, could not escape the scars etched into her memory. Both spent the rest of their lives in institutional care, their futures stolen in the name of one woman's obsession with domination. Guadalupe was imprisoned in the infamous Cárcel de Belén, where her reputation preceded her. Even among thieves and murderers, her crimes were unthinkable. She was placed in solitary confinement for her own safety, though safety was a relative term. Her presence provoked revulsion. Inmates hurled insults, objects, and threats whenever she passed. The guards, many with daughters of their own, did little to intervene. Once revered, Guadalupe was now the lowest creature in the prison's hierarchy. Stripped of her gowns, her salons, and her illusion of control, she deteriorated rapidly. Her once regal presence gave way to a haggard shadow of herself. The woman who had spoken with icy clarity in court now mumbled incoherently, her words ignored. Most cruelly of all, the isolation she had once cherished for its privacy became a sentence she couldn't endure. Without victims to control, her identity unraveled. In the winter of 1895, just 2 years into her sentence, Guadalupe Bejarano was found dead in her cell. The official cause was listed as pneumonia, but guards quietly confirmed that she bore injuries consistent with an assault. No investigation followed. No charges were filed. No one mourned her passing. A priest performed the burial rites out of obligation. No family claimed the body. No obituary ran in the papers. The woman who had once ruled Mexico City's highest circles disappeared as anonymously as the girls she had buried in shallow graves. But her legacy could not be erased. The Bejarano case changed Mexico. For the first time, the country was forced to acknowledge that monsters didn't only live in the shadows, they thrived among the elite. That evil didn't always arrive with blood on its hands, but often wore pearls and offered donations to the church. The investigation revealed systemic failure on every level. Police dismissed missing girl reports because the families were poor. Doctors provided tools and knowledge without asking questions. Clergy accepted blood-stained charity in exchange for silence. And most damning of all, Mexico City's elite, those who whispered their suspicions, had said nothing. Because silence was easier, but change followed. New laws mandated that all missing person reports be investigated regardless of status. Medical practitioners faced stricter oversight. And for the first time in Mexican jurisprudence, serial murder was recognized as a distinct and heinous crime with corresponding penalties. Most enduring, however, was the shift in public consciousness. Thanks to Posada's searing engravings and the public spectacle of the trial, Guadalupe became more than a killer. She became a cautionary tale, a story told to children, a reminder to all. Decades later, the mansion on Tuba Street was scheduled for demolition. During renovations, workers discovered the remnants of the basement chamber. Even in its abandonment, the place carried an atmosphere so oppressive that laborers refused to enter. Locals whispered that on quiet nights, the screams still echoed from beneath the ruins. Eventually, the structure was torn down, but the legend remained. Guadalupe Bejarano's story endures because it exposes a truth too often ignored, that evil rarely announces itself with menace. It arrives in manners and smiles. It hides in church pews and charity balls. It thrives in silence, and it feeds on society's reluctance to believe the worst of those who look the part of virtue. Her crimes were not possible because she was extraordinary, but because she understood how to weaponize the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. She knew that her greatest disguise wasn't cruelty, it was respectability. So we must ask, how many other monsters have walked among us, protected by our disbelief? What secrets still lie buried beneath the floors of houses built on trust? Let us know what you think. Did Guadalupe take more secrets to the grave? Could others have been saved if someone had spoken sooner? Share your thoughts in the comments. How can we better protect those most vulnerable from predators who wear polite faces? If you were gripped by this tale of Mexico's first female serial killer, subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with someone who loves dark history. Because in the stories that history tried to bury, we often find the warnings we most need to hear. See you in the next episode, where we uncover another shadow from the past. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.